Why is there so much inequality in the world today, and what's going wrong?
People could tolerate rising inequality at a point when everybody seemed to be getting a little bit better off.
Now you're feeling, even in developed countries, the air getting sucked out of the middle class.
When you see Asians rising, when you see China's rising, and you open up the picture at the micro level, it's a totally different case.
Our education is designed to supply urban life. I mean, our education is not designed to enable you to live in the non-urban setting and able to produce.
Without any clear rules of engagement and division of roles between the state and the market, the savage market wins, all the time.
But now we see what the rich are doing, we are seeing what the powerful are doing, and we're not happy.
You all by now know that Asia is rising. And I suppose you also know that because I wrote a book about that. And I think Asia will continue rising, will continue doing well. But it's now also clear that rising Asia is going to meet rising challenges. And as you can see, one of the themes here that we're discussing are the rising challenges that Asia will face. And I think you're going to have a fairly interesting and stimulating discussion this afternoon on some of these big challenges we're going to face. The second point is to say some thank yous. And the biggest thank you we want to make is to all the supporters of this wonderful thing that my colleague Daryl Jarvis and his team have produced called the Asian Trends Monitoring Bulletin. And if you haven't got it yet, I strongly recommend that you get it. It touches upon many of the key challenges, as you know, the region is facing. And of course, all this is made possible by the generous support of our benefactors. And so I want to begin, first of all, by thanking the Rockefeller Foundation, and a special round of applause for the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Judith Rodin, who's here with us today. And your job is to convince her that this is a very good investment. I also want to thank the Center for Strategic Futures of Singapore for also supporting this, the Asian Trends Monitoring Bulletin, and the good work that it has done. My first question is to Fujun. And as we all know, China has been very successful in building basic infrastructure and providing access to water, sanitation, electricity, especially in rural areas. So the question for Fujun is, what should developing countries in ASEAN take away from China's success in infrastructure?
The short answer is easy. You have to maintain a reasonable balance, I say reasonable balance, between state on this side and the market on that side. Have we reached a reasonable state? It's up for debates. And indeed, there are internal debates in China as well. And globally, there are debates about the role of the state vis-a-vis the goal of a market. When you're talking about infrastructure are of a public good. So theoretically and empirically, that will give rise to the argument for the role of the government. Now, having said that, I think the point that I want to convey is that, well, for the government to have money to invest in infrastructure, where would the money come from? There, I think you must have a robust market first. And there I want to talk about the importance of building the marketplace in China. Remember, the whole program of our economic development is called reforms and opening up. By reform, we mean how to increase allocative efficiency within the system by drawing upon lessons by that very memorable phrase called invisible hand. It's not that we have reached the invisible hand, it's because we start from a highly hierarchical central planning system and moving towards the marketplace. We are not there yet, precisely. We are in the midst of that. And in the process, there must have been a higher level of productivity gains in the process. And opening up is also very important because ultimately, for an economy to move forward, the market to be productive, we must have higher level of technology by opening up China to the rest of the world. That allow us a very effective ways to learn from the rest of the world. So if I look at the past 30 years, it's a process of learning from the rest of the world. Schumpeter has this very memorable phrase called creative destruction. Ultimately, for human society to move forward, it's not just the allocative efficiency. More important that is you push the frontier of human technology. And by opening ourselves up to the rest of the world, we have been closing the gap between ourselves and the advanced economies. And in the process, we have learned a lot in terms of hardware. And much more important than hardware is what I call institutional technologies. And the much more difficult job is for us to learn the institutional technology. Now, we have gained a lot from learning the hardware. I guess for the next round of learning, we must be very earnest in learning the institutional technologies. As long as we proceed in that process, we'll have more efficiency to gain from the marketplace when you have a robust market and you have broad base for taxation and the state has money and use the money to build new rounds of infrastructure. So I guess this is the dynamic game that where you must see a reasonable balance between the state and the market.
Senator Nin had a slightly different nuance about the state-market balance. You want to quickly come back on that?
You see, for a country like Vietnam that moved from central command economy, subsidized economy, I think not enough thinking was given to the special case of the so-called public goods that are education and health. So it was easy to say, let the market do what it does best. So in the production of goods, it wasn't much of a problem. There was broad public support to it. But today, the question is, if you let the market move into the hospitals and the schools without any clear rules of engagement and division of roles between the state and the market, the savage market wins, all the time. And so now you've got the worst of each system in our, public hospitals and public or state-owned schools. So the issue, I think, proper thinking has to be done about the relationship between state and market when it comes to the provision of directly human-related services like education and public health.
As you know, and as we said earlier, Indonesia is one of the countries that is still struggling to provide rural access to infrastructure despite successfully developing its urban areas. Do you think that will the ASEAN Master Plan on connectivity be good enough to provide connectivity to these off-grid areas?
It could serve as a start, but Indonesia is so huge in terms of its territory. It stretches like from San Francisco to Boston or London to Ankara. So it's the spread of the territory make the challenge of ASEAN connectivity will definitely serve the western part of Indonesia, but it may not help much in terms of the eastern part of Indonesia. There is a challenge on providing that infrastructure there. And I think I would like to continue that point. This is the part which our government needs to do more. Mentioned earlier about infrastructure, education, health service, and on top of that, rule of law. These are four things that when it is being privatized early, the fourth point cannot be privatized. There's no private rule of law enforcement there. But I think this is the part that needs a development. And I must also say that when we talk about inequality, yes, it's inequality in terms of income, but also inequality in terms of geographic. And this is, I think, the challenge that Indonesia must address that perhaps is rather different than any other country in ASEAN. The challenge is not only about urban and rural, or between those who are educated and not educated, those who are working and not working, but also those who happen to live in the remote areas across the archipelago. No less than 5,000 islands inhabited in Indonesia. So a different strategy must be adopted to actually surface in terms of infrastructure development in Indonesia. One way to do that is Indonesia adopted decentralization policy. Since 2001, authority has been decentralized to local government. That helps in terms of speed of service. But on the other hand, the country is also experiencing a corruption issue. Follows decentralizations is authority at the local level in a corrupt institutions that may not help much. But I think as a design at the beginning, it is already there, and it has helped to actually expedite government service at the local level, including addressing some of the infrastructure problem.
But you know, if you look at this chart that you have in front of you, you can see right there, Indonesia, as you can see, it seems to be more or less behind the cluster of the other ASEAN countries in terms of access to sanitation and water. It's only Laos and Cambodia behind. When do you think Indonesia will come up to this sort of level of Philippines or Vietnam? What's your sense? What time frame are we speaking about?
In the next few years, we are now seeing an improvement in terms of expectations. Part of the reason of this problem is because expectation is very low. In Indonesia today, if you run a survey on people's satisfactions toward government service on education or on health, more than 70–75% of the populations would have responded happy or very happy with the service. Why is that they're very happy? 3/4 of the populations? Because the expectation is low. Many of them moving from no service to a little service. And that is already an improvement. And why that needs to be pushed further, I think so that demand for the provisions of this service is there. But how can we increase the bar of expectations? Education helps a lot. The presence of education, educated group in the communities help to raise the bar higher. And Indonesia, in terms of basic education, is good, but in terms of middle education, we are developing it that year.
And now we're going to the question of the unbanked and the unconnected. And there's some surprising statistic here, and I think we're going to switch now to the next slide. You know, the Philippines and Vietnam now have more than 100 mobiles per 100 people, almost full delivery. However, at the same time, more than 70% of their population does not have access to financial services. By contrast, in Kenya, a new mobile money service called M-Pesa has created a buzz in the industry, and in only 4 years, it is now used by 70% of Kenyan adults. So the question I'm actually going to pose to Gideon is, why are banks and telecommunications companies not moving faster to exploit this business opportunity through mobile banking in other regions, in particular in Asia? And why is Kenya ahead of Asia in this area?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Kenyans think.
Maybe that's the problem, Kishore, I don't know. But no, I mean, I think the M-Pesa story has become one of those iconic development stories that you read about everywhere, a bit like, as we were saying over lunch, like the Grameen Bank. It's something that's quoted all the time. And it is quite an inspiring story because it shows how technology can allow you to kind of leap a whole stage and give poor people access to financial services, gives them greater financial security and more economic opportunity. But it is also interesting, I think, that it hasn't been replicated yet in anywhere else. And it does raise the question of, well, you know, is there something unique about Kenya, or is there something inherent to the model that makes it quite hard to replicate? And I was discussing this with one of your researchers, Johannes, is looking into this. And one of the things we thought might be unique to Kenya, or that made it particularly easy to do it in Kenya, is that it's got one mobile phone company which provides 80% of the coverage. Now, normally that would be regarded as a bad thing, kind of anti-competitive, and it's good to have many mobile operators. But it's had the positive spin-off in Kenya of meaning that you know, everybody can participate in the M-Pesa system because they're not on different mobile operators. And the fragmentation of the mobile phone providers in other countries, perhaps in Asia, may be one problem for why it's not being adopted. Another is a lack of people who will provide the kind of rudimentary deposit and withdrawal services, because you can transfer money to other people via mobile phone, but if you've got some cash, you still need somewhere to deposit it. And you need a network of things that aren't quite banks, but that are participating in the M-Pesa system. So that's another problem. And it also may be that the poor are still, a very low margin business. So banks, if they're looking in a rapidly expanding economies like Asia for, well, where can they get their biggest return for their buck, they may not initially look at the poor. But I think, if one regards it as a social good, what's happening in Kenya, this as an opportunity, there may be things that governments in this region can do to encourage.
Somebody was trying mobile banking.
Exactly. I have a very large deposit coming to their account. But there may be things that the governments can do in terms of regulation, in terms of getting banks together and mobile phone operators together to actually give the process a push.
Yeah.
Can I comment on that?
Yes, please,
Because
please.
we do a great deal of work in Kenya, and we've studied the evolution of M-Pesa really significantly. The other half of the equation is that while there was only one large cell phone company, there are many, many, many banks. And what happened is the banks started competing with one another to get on the cell phone platform. And so it opened it up very quickly, and it accelerated the development well beyond anyone's expectations. The other thing is the opposite of what you would imagine, and that is it happened so quickly that the government didn't have time to get in and regulate the industry. And so it was actually the lack of government regulation and a regulatory framework that allowed it to mobilize so quickly. And that's why maybe a second country can't be as quick a mover, because now everybody's watching it, governments are interested, and all of the other domains that usually come in when there's a new industry are mobilized in a way that wasn't the case in Kenya.
But Judith, do you see any other country that's moving to be the next Kenya in mobile phone banking?
Well, I think Rwanda's thinking about it, certainly East Africa. The other thing is that they didn't have broadband until the cables got laid, penetrated, and so mobile became an accelerator industry in a different way than West Africa, or certainly than Asia. And it just opened up that opportunity again in a different way. And it's why South Africa doesn't have it, because they had broadband penetration and other platforms for this kind of development. I hope it's not unique, because I do think that, and I know that large banks in this region are looking at the system. Here, obviously, you can use your smart card to go on the subway. So banks are thinking about how to use their technology for all sorts of things. And I think mobile banking and other forms of mobile health are definitely viewed in this region as the wave of the future.
I'm not quite convinced about the importance of mobile banking. What I mean is, first of all, you need to take a closer look. It's not, Vietnam is underbanked, if you mean, institutional banking. But there are all other forms of, moving the money, moving the resources, saving, very diverse forms, not quite institutionalized, but they may perhaps serve their purpose. And so I think, while if you say, you cite Kenya, what good has it done to, the underdogs in Kenya? That's the important thing. It's not just saying so many percent are banked, on mobile devices.
Has it helped to reduce poverty? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, or has it encouraged, stimulated small micro enterprises? Has it helped boost up savings? Has it helped? I don't know. What I mean is further analysis is needed. I think if you quote Kenya, fine, but you need a full-fledged analysis. And second, you need to look at very diverse practices that are current in Asia. At least I know in the case of Vietnam, people will manage to, I see that they are very nimble in buying up real estate and land. And it might not always go through banks. You see, so the picture is a bit more complex than just the statistics.
Good. And I hope. Sorry, you can come in, Anis.
Yeah, but also not only banking in that sense, because these ICT things that is now penetrating to the rural area, in the case of Indonesia, for instance, helps a lot for the farmers.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the past, farmers, in the past they had no clue how much is their product is actually being sold at the market. Today they can actually track the market price, and therefore it has helped to push their sort of a standing point vis-a-vis the brokers. It's usually in between the farmers and the market. So not only in terms of banks, but also in terms of at least having a symmetric information between players. That's very important.
From bank to within banks and from bank to bank using the mobile banking system. So it's a kind of hybrid, essentially, which the Indonesians have been very strong on, and I think the Filipinos as well, actually.
As we all know, microfinance has seen spectacular growth in the last decade. But as you know, recent scandals such as the standoff between microfinance providers and the government in Andhra Pradesh in India has triggered calls for tighter regulation on microfinance. So earlier you mentioned the regulatory point. Do you think we need a new regulatory revolution in developing countries to facilitate the growth of innovative services that benefit the poor? And maybe would less regulation be better than more regulation in this area?
Well, innovative financial services, I think, are well beyond microfinance. And so whether we're talking about the new field of impact investing, which is double bottom line investing that looks for social and financial returns, or what people are calling the hybrid value chain, how large corporations can hire and serve the bottom of the pyramid in a new and different way. All of these are frameworks that are just being experimented with and promoted in many places in the world. And it's going to take a broad policy structure, because obviously certainty is what makes markets work, predictability and certainty, particularly financial markets. And so if you're looking at all of these market-based solutions, it's not which regulations, it's the fact of having some regulatory framework that embraces the new industry, that allows it to move forward, allows innovation to occur. But I would highlight again that it really is the fact of policy rather than regulation. Sometimes it's going to be a non-regulatory agency, but a robust public policy framework that accelerates innovation, particularly in these new fields that are going to serve the poor and vulnerable people in various places in the world.
Yeah, this is my question to Karim Raslan. We know that chronic diseases rates and their risk factors are fast increasing in Malaysia, which surprisingly has the worst indicators for obesity and diabetes in ASEAN. You know, Malaysia is a successful, prosperous country. So the questions we have for Karim is, how do the Malaysians view these challenges? And what can be done to stem the rise of these chronic diseases of obesity and diabetes? And we chose Karim because he's obviously not obese, you know.
Well, I think first is interesting because in so many ways, a country like Malaysia, its rhetoric is about being first world and trying its best to be first world. And in terms of disease, we are definitely heading in that direction. But in so many other ways, we are lagging. And it's also ironic in that we have a very interventionist government in so many ways, which seeks to prescribe to our people what we should and should not do, should and should not read. And yet, in terms of public health, we've kind of let people go. So perhaps there needs to be far more intervention. And then finally, the point is, I feel very strongly, is that, I mean, we have some of the most generous sugar subsidies in Asia, leading to some of the highest levels of smuggling around Asia. We provide much of the sugar for the Indonesians at great discount. I've been in Pontianak and watched, you know, little people carrying the sugar across the border in enormous numbers. Oh yeah, and same in Thailand as well. So what we're doing essentially is subsidizing much of the region. But this, it kind of shows this kind of ironic interdependence, but also this sense that we want to be first world, we fail to be, and yet we are so willing to just give people anything just to keep them happy, sugar being the most important constituent part of the Malaysian diet. Malay, Indian, Chinese, we all like everything to be very sugary and sweet as
But
we all
actually, Karima, obesity is a first world disease.
That's what I mean.
It was kind of the odd. I always struck me that it was odd in the United States. You could tell poor people because they were so fat, not because they were poor.
Yeah.
Oh, not because they were thin.
Diet.
Yeah, exactly.
You had a point, Alice?
On top of sugar, I think this region consume rice so much compared to the rest of the world. I think the average, I was looking at the number, in the world is about 62 kilograms per year per capita. And here in Southeast Asia, it's amazing. Look, Myanmar, 228 kilograms. Vietnam, 215. Cambodia, 160. And then Indonesia, 150. Thailand, 148. So it's almost 3 times the average. And I think
but in our part of the world, unless you have rice, you don't feel you've eaten. You know, so I mean, it is so central. You know, it's psychological. You can eat noodles, but you still must have rice.
Indonesia is perhaps one of interesting place because in the past it's Javanese and people in Sumatrans that actually rice consumer. And in the eastern part was different, but today riceations is actually take place.
As you can see,
Rockefeller founded the International Rice Research Institute 50 years ago. And
in Philippines.
in the Philippines, and part of its role was really to breed the quality of rice that attracted all of this consumption today. So I apologize.
Now we know who to blame. Blame the Rockefeller Foundation. But as you can see, rice is life is one of the themes of this Asian Trends Monitoring Bulletin. They obviously anticipated this would come up in the discussion today. Now, the last question before we open the floor to the question and answers, and this is Senator Nin. And as we know, Vietnam is one of the top regional performers in reducing maternal deaths. What factors contribute to Vietnam's success in this area of reducing maternal deaths?
To do justice to the Vietnamese government prior to reunification, it has been a government or state policy to pay attention to so-called social equity and delivery of social services. But with the Đổi mới and the reforms, we have had the means to implement that policy better. So first of all, in terms of the coverage, a network of health services across the country. In Vietnam, 95% of births are attended by trained health workers. It's also a matter of general education of the women and of health education. 86% of women had more than 3 prenatal visits to check about their own health prior to delivery. And of course, we benefit from the improved access to clean water, sanitation, and the road network, because as we discussed over lunch, if you deliver and there's a problem and you need the doctor, he has to be able and come. So the road network is very important as well. Finally, I would say that in Vietnam, the main challenge that remains in this respect is the ethnic minority women. There is still a gap, a sizable gap between delivery of services and quality of services between the ethnic majority women and ethnic minority women, including so all of that in the countryside. That will be the major challenge left, although we are slated to meet the Millennium Development Goals in this respect.
Great. Now, before I turn the floor, open up for questions from the floor, I'm going to share with you that at lunch today, and I'm sorry, Judith, you were not there, there was a fascinating discussion that the panelists had about how the zeitgeist of the world has changed on the whole attitude towards inequalities. You know, the theme today is rising in Asia, rising inequality. And how 20 years ago or 30 years ago, both Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping would agree that to get rich is glorious, you know. And suddenly all that's disappearing, and all around the world there's a rising level of concern, indeed political anger, indeed riots in London about why is there so much inequality in the world today and what's going wrong. I think that's a new political phenomenon we find also, that's also affecting the Arab Spring, also surely affecting trends in this region. So I was going to ask the panel members very quickly to just share why you think these attitudes towards rising inequality, the concerns about rising inequality have become so much sharper and stronger now. Gideon, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I must say it's interesting for me to come here to Asia to discuss inequality in Asia because, you know, it's become a very big theme in the West. And we slightly perhaps had a over-sanguine picture about what was going on in Asia. We assumed that everybody was doing fine here and that our inequality had something to do with, in fact, with the rise of Asia because of the downward pressure. Seriously. Because of the downward pressure on the wages of the unskilled, basically.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, you ask, well, why has it become more acute as a debate? I think in the Western world, it's very closely connected to the economic crash because people could tolerate rising inequality at a point when everybody seemed to be getting a little bit better off. You know, even if that was a wealth illusion created by easy credit or whatever in the United States and in Europe. But now that you know, unemployment is rising, people are getting absolutely worse off in the lower cohorts. I think the vision of you know, the super rich becomes that much more offensive, and therefore it's affecting the political dialogue. So that, you know, Obama has made the campaign for higher taxes on the rich an absolutely central point of, you know, what will be his re-election campaign. And you can see in Europe, you know, the so-called indignant, the young Spanish, the young French, the Greeks saying, you know, inequality is a major concern of theirs. So it's entering the political debate. And as you mentioned, it's all around the world. I mean, I think it was a strong element in the Arab Spring. You see it in the demonstrations in Israel, about Chile, absolutely. So, and interestingly, both Chile and Israel were, I think, countries which placed a strong accent on growth, on free market reforms, you know, and left behind a previous era where there'd been more egalitarian societies. So Israel had the kibbutz movement, but then lately they've had this, for the last 10 years, a very kind of free market Chicago school government. And I think that there's now perhaps a public reaction swinging back the other way.
Karim?
I think I totally subscribe to what Gideon's saying. It's right there. The interesting point, though, is even in countries which are going through economic growth, prosperity, such as Singapore, even Malaysia to a degree, you're seeing the rise of a greater rise of resentment against those who are succeeding at the top end. Why? It comes back, I feel, to media in many ways. We have this influx of social media. In the past, there was a kind of a gap between what people would have been doing in HDB estates and what was going on in the elite. But now you're living cheek by jowl with it. You see it. It's there in Facebook. It's there on Twitter. You're constantly face to face with those who are living so much better than you. And you kind of wonder why. And the resentment, the sense of expectation, the failure to match that is so real. We see this in Malaysia very, very powerfully. And I think it's very much the case here. And also, as Kishore, you said, in the past, totalitarian or authoritarian governments could control the media space, but increasingly you can't. And because of that, other forms of information are coming through which governments would have liked to prevent. But now we see what the rich are doing, we are seeing what the powerful are doing, and we're not happy. And it's ironic. So even in Asia, with growth, the resentment is rising. So it isn't just a product of societies going through the painful recession or whatever.
Judith, you want to come in there?
I think that the evidence shows that it's not only a post-recession period in which we've been seeing this. In almost every country in which there's been enormous growth over the past 10 years or so, within that country there's been growing inequality. And that hadn't happened at prior time periods. When there was growth, people at the bottom end were lifted, but now you're feeling, even in developed countries, the air getting sucked out of the middle class. And so people are falling at the bottom, not only not growing. In the developing countries in which there's been extraordinary growth, the inequality has grown as well. And to really understand this, one has to look at the structural situation that created that. Part of this is we are in a completely different era technologically, so it's easy for us in the West to blame it on outsourcing jobs to Asia or whatever, but the truth is that in our part of the world there are going to be fewer jobs, and that may be actually a structural phenomenon that our governments are not yet really prepared to deal with. How the Asian societies and countries in the Middle East deal with this growing class of people who have expectations because they're seeing increased wealth without systematic and intentional job creation, whether that's done by the markets or some combination of market and government forces. Most governments really haven't confronted.
Sorry, Judith, I have to disagree. I think you're looking at a situation in Malaysia, Singapore, where you have pretty much full employment. The fact is that expectations are constantly, it's relative. So you can all be in a job, but you are resentful of those who are earning so much more than you.
Yes, no, I agree with that. So in some countries, that's where I was going, so thanks. In some countries, it's going to be creating the jobs. In other countries, it's going to be creating good jobs that allow the opportunity for that to increase. And we have focused too much, I think, globally on just counting the number of jobs rather than focusing on what the quality of the job will be. And I think that's what's going to have to happen, not just having numerics that count the number of unemployed.
A brief point. I just wondered whether globalization actually is creating income inequality around the world because it empowers employers to look all over the world. They've got a global labor force now. And so there's constant pressure to find someone cheaper who can do it, and that widens the returns for the guy with the capital, but it puts downward pressure on the worker.
And also, I think, for instance, look at
is it in Indonesia? Is a concern about inequality rising too?
It is. It is a concern now. Yes, definitely. I think poverty have reduced significantly, but the gap between the poor and the haves is really there. And I think part of the reasons is because our economy is often designed as an urban-based economy, industrialized-based economy. And the case of Indonesia, for instance, in which the countryside, the rural economy, or agriculture-based economy has not yet touched as much as the industrializations. And that helps to actually see the gap between the haves and the have-nots is almost also equivalent to the gap between the rural and the urban. And I think part of the reason too is because our education is designed to supply urban life. I mean, our education is not designed to enable you to live in the non-urban setting and able to produce. And I think that's also part of the reasons why we're seeing this gap widening.
Kishore, for me to look at...
In China too, it's growing, right, the concern?
Yes. Well, let me look at the globe first. I see a tremendous mismatch between the global reach of capital. The capital is, the reach is global.
Can go anywhere.
Whereas the regulatory framework of the economy continue to be nation state. So there is a match. So if you look at factors of production, capital moves out on a global basis to find the most optimal configuration of factors. So if you represent the capital, you're the ones who gain. And in the past 3 decades, that group of people has gained tremendously at the cost of labor. Labor tend to be slow, right, to move. You need to have a passport, visa, a lot of other things, all kinds of different regulations. Now for me to look at China, China has been growing, but also you see the growing of the gap between rich and the poor. And fundamentally, you mentioned the word structure. I also see very strong structural shadows that are driving apart the gap between rich and the poor, because for the past 3 decades, we have marketized the goods market, the commodity markets, without correspondingly marketize the factors of production so that, well, the political power continue to control factors of production, such that when someone has access to power and also have access to goods market, it's so easy to strike rich. And unless you ameliorate the mismatch between the two, and it's going to be very difficult in spite of the fact, policy-wise, we have announced the goals to narrow that gap. But without corresponding institutions to ameliorate that problem, and I think it will be very difficult.
Globalization, connectivity, education, and demographics.
Yeah.
I think we need to touch upon demographics. The rapidly aging Asia has to prepare itself for an increased burden because of the growing elderly population that will require, different kind of long-term care and therefore financial costs. And already we see in the first world that they are having this huge challenge. They don't know how to deal with in the US, but also in Western European countries. So all of this, globalization, connectivity, education, and demographics, they pose both opportunities in terms of movement. You have migrant workers who discover the world, but it poses also problems of vulnerability. So the vulnerability of the growing elderly population, the vulnerability of the migrant workers. 1/3 of Asian migrant workers stay in Asia, and they pose a problem. How do you deal with the migrant workers? What kind of rights and access to basic rights you give them? That problem already exists in Europe and to a lesser extent, but still in the US. But Singapore, Japan, Korea will have to deal with those issues. So I just wanted to sort of throw some light on the kind of, again, problematic that we need to sort of look for, prepare ourselves for in the coming years.
Thank you. Now you can.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.